The year is 27 BC and the Roman Republic has just named its first ever emperor. But who was this guy and how did he become so powerful? Well, today we're going to take a look at Rome's first emperor, Augustus, and find out exactly how he won the title of emperor. Before we get started, now back to the video. Born Gaius Octavius on September in the year 63 BC, Augustus would be the last of the first emperors of Rome. He was born into the patrician class, a wealthy landowner in the Italian countryside, and by the standards of the day, quite well off. His father had actually been a Roman senator, and his mother was the sister of Julius Caesar. Because of this family connection, Octavian grew up with Caesar's son, Caesarion, and the two were quite close. In fact, according to the historian Suetonius, Caesar had even designated Caesarion as his heir before his assassination. It was also thanks to his mother that young Octavian was adopted by his great-uncle, Gaius Julius Caesar. This made Octavian Caesar's heir instead, and thus the heir of the Roman Republic itself. But unfortunately for Octavian, there was just one little problem with this plan. According to the will of Julius Caesar, Octavian was not actually related enough to be considered his heir. You see, while Octavian was the nephew of Julius Caesar, he was only the nephew by marriage. Julius Caesar had wanted his wealth and titles to pass to his biological family line, and so under Roman law, Octavian could not inherit any of Julius Caesar's titles or wealth. Not wanting this whole situation to end up in the courts, Octavian decided to change his name to Augustus and marched on Rome with an army to force his way to the top. Of course, it wasn't as easy as just marching on Rome, though. See, when Julius Caesar was assassinated, Rome was controlled by his adopted son and heir, Mark Antony. Mark Antony and Octavian had once been quite close, as the two had fought together in many of Caesar's military campaigns. But after Caesar's death, their relationship deteriorated. Octavian claimed that he was Julius Caesar's true heir, while Mark Antony clung to the belief that Caesar's true heir was his own son, Caesarion. But Mark Antony wasn't the only obstacle in Augustus's path. Rome was still technically a republic, and the Senate, which held most of the political power in Rome, didn't want to be ruled by a monarch. They feared that Augustus's claim to the throne was merely a Trojan horse to turn Rome into a dictatorship. And so, Augustus would have to fight a civil war against both Mark Antony and the Roman Senate to become the first emperor of Rome. To make things even more complicated, both Mark Antony and Octavian had formed alliances with Cleopatra, the ruler of Egypt. Mark Antony had fallen in love with Cleopatra, and the two had 3 children together. These children gave Mark Antony leverage over the eastern provinces, as local governors were beholden to him if they wished to secure trade along the Nile River. In addition, Cleopatra gave Mark Antony 1,000 warships, half of all the ships in the Egyptian navy, to use in his war against Octavian. With these ships, Mark Antony could easily dominate the Mediterranean Sea. On the other hand, Octavian had an advantage of his own. The majority of Rome's veteran legions backed him in the war against Mark Antony. These veterans owed their careers to Julius Caesar himself and followed Octavian into battle because they believed that he was the true heir of Caesar. In addition, Octavian's propaganda team was making sure that he got the support of the Roman people. Using posters, pamphlets, and statues, the Roman public was slowly convinced that Augustus was the chosen one of Caesar. And while Augustus had the support of the people, Mark Antony had the support of the Roman Senate, specifically through his wife, Octavia Minor. She was the sister of Augustus and the daughter of the first triumvir, a title created by Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. While Octavia and Antony were married, the couple had no love for each other. They began to grow apart after Mark Antony became infatuated with Cleopatra. Soon the two would formally separate, and Octavia returned home to live with her father, who was the stepfather of both Augustus and Mark Antony. The next few years saw much of the fighting take place between Augustus's navy and that of Cleopatra's. With neither side able to gain control of the seas, the fighting dragged on. It wasn't until 32 BC when Augustus's navy finally defeated the combined forces of Cleopatra and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium. Although Antony and Cleopatra survived the battle, they fled to Alexandria in Egypt, where they would eventually die by suicide. With his rivals defeated, Augustus was free to march on Alexandria with his legions. However, before he could lay siege to the city, Cleopatra died, allegedly by the bite of an asp. When Augustus entered Alexandria, he found that Mark Antony had taken his own life. With the defeat of Mark Antony and the loss of Cleopatra, Augustus's victory was complete. He had just won a civil war against the greatest powers in the Mediterranean and had emerged victorious. But what exactly did this victory mean for Augustus? To answer that question, let's take a look at how Augustus set up the Roman Empire. After securing his victory over Mark Antony, Augustus began to reform the government of Rome. At the core of these reforms was the idea that while he was the head of the state, Rome was still a republic. Technically, the Roman Republic still existed. The Senate was still the governing body of Rome, and the consuls still held the highest offices in the land. However, Augustus was essentially a constitutional monarch. He appointed loyalists to key positions within the government to ensure that they would do his bidding. For example, he established the Praetorian Guard to protect the person of the emperor, as well as serve as a military force in times of peace. He also expanded the Roman bureaucracy and standardized the system of collecting taxes across the empire. This brought greater efficiency to the tax collection process, but also meant that the provinces paid more revenue to Rome than ever before. But by far, the greatest impact of Augustus's reign was his establishment of the Pax Romana, a period of peace and prosperity throughout the entire Roman world. During Augustus's reign, Rome enjoyed over 200 years of peace, which allowed trade and culture to flourish throughout the empire. It was during the Pax Romana that roads were built, aqueducts were constructed, buildings and temples were erected, and cities flourished. In fact, during this time, Rome experienced unprecedented growth. When Augustus took power in 27 BC, Rome was only a small city, barely holding 1 million inhabitants. By the end of his reign in 14 AD, Rome had grown to be the largest city in the world, boasting around 4 million people. To put this in perspective, the next largest city in the world at the time was far smaller, holding only about 500,000 people. And so, thanks to the peace brought on by Augustus, Rome truly became the center of the ancient world. But despite all of his accomplishments, Augustus never liked the title of king or emperor. Instead, he preferred to be called princeps, which literally translates to chief citizen. The reason why Augustus disliked the title of emperor so much is because he feared that it would destroy the stability of the Roman government. You see, in Rome, the Senate had traditionally hated monarchs and would never accept a king over the republic. But the title of emperor was neutral and didn't invoke any of the traditional anti-monarchist sentiment of the Romans. Augustus felt that by being the first princeps, he could keep the appearance of republicanism alive, even though he was really a constitutional monarch. Unfortunately for Augustus, this charade didn't last for very long. After his death in 14 AD, his stepson Tiberius took the title of emperor. From then on, every leader of Rome would hold the title of emperor. So while Augustus may have not wanted to be called emperor, it was thanks to him that the Roman Empire was born. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe for more content. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. I'll see you next time.